the number in your original email. Members, if you're able, please activate your video and keep it on for the duration of the meeting. Staff, if you're able, please activate your video when you're speaking. Panelists have the ability, please use the raise hand feature when you'd like to be recognized to speak, ask questions, or request a roll call vote. Lowering your hand will take you out of the queue. Members of the public who have registered to speak, the name you entered in Zoom must match the name you entered in registration. You will remain muted until called upon. The clerk will tell you when your time is up. After speaking, a member of the body may ask you a question. If you need to share documentation with the commission, please send it to the email listed on today's agenda. Chair Zellers, floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, first on our agenda is public comment, and we do have a couple of people registered for public comment. The first registrant is Michael J. Lawton, District 11, Eau Claire Avenue, Madison, opposed and wishing to speak, and he is representing the Hill Farms Association. Michael, you will have 3 minutes.
I actually registered for now item number 2, but are you doing them under public comment?
Yes.
Okay, because we haven't had a presentation from the staff, so it's just, okay.
If you would rather, we will wait then until after the presentation from staff. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think the staff will mind. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Then we will move on to disclosures and recusals. Members of the body should make any required disclosures or recusals under the city's ethics code. Are there any disclosures or recusals? Seeing none, we will move on then to agenda item 2, which is our special item of business and our only item of business, and that's a discussion of bus rapid transit. And we do have several staff members here, Ben Zellers, Colin Punt, as well as of course Heather. And we also have Tom Lynch and Philip Gritzmacher from the Department of Transportation. And I believe that Ben is going to give the presentation from staff.
Yes, thank you. I will share my screen here and then dive in. Okay, there we go. So yes, going to be running through transit-oriented development overlay zoning, and certainly looking forward to the discussion at the end of this presentation. So for this presentation, we'll be looking at a quick recap of the September 30th Plan Commission TOD overlay discussion. Then have a few staff thoughts and recommendations on TOD overlay parcels to include, adjustments to TOD overlay, and touch on historic districts as they relate to that as well. And then spend the majority of the presentation on example TOD overlay adjustments. We have 2 example zoning districts, and then have several case study example parcels as it relates to TOD overlay and what that could potentially have, what impacts that could potentially have on certain parcels based on those parcels zoning. Then have a lot of time towards the end for questions and discussion by the commission. So just a quick refresher, this is the route that we're referring to when we look at bus rapid transit and how a TOD overlay would potentially come into play along the planned BRT line. The green boundary shows a buffer of a quarter mile around the bus rapid transit corridor. The pink boundary shows a half-mile buffer of the bus rapid transit corridor. So we started discussion of this transit-oriented development overlay at the September 30th Plan Commission meeting. There were some mixed thoughts on a quarter mile versus half mile buffer from the planned BRT line for this TOD overlay. Majority of commission members favored a fixed distance from the BRT corridor as opposed to planned station areas. There was consensus to exclude local historic districts, some mixed thoughts on whether to exclude National Register historic districts or to what extent those should be excluded. from TOD overlay. Then staff also mentioned the possibility of excluding the downtown area, generally Blair to Park Street, as it already has maximum heights that have been established by the zoning code. And that is one of the certainly major items that would be included in the TOD overlay is an increase in maximum heights. So as staff, right now we're recommending moving forward with a quarter-mile BRT buffer for a couple of reasons, and certainly can answer further questions on this and discuss this towards the end of the presentation. But we feel that that'll capture parcels that are most likely to be influenced by bus rapid transit. The area between a quarter mile and a half mile tends to bring in many more single-family residential parcels, which we think are not as likely to be influenced by TOD overlay, especially at that distance from BRT. And then as staff, we're recommending excluding local and national historic districts at this point. We just emphasize that redevelopment is still possible under historic districts under standard non-overlay zoning. And in discussing this issue with the Department of Transportation, they felt it was appropriate to exclude National Register districts to reduce the possibility of Section 106 impacts on the BRT project from this TOD overlay process. And I know, as mentioned, Philip and Tom are available if there are any specific questions later on relating to that. Then also, we're recommending that, as I mentioned, the downtown area be excluded from TOD overlay, as well as zoning districts that are shown here: planned development, agriculture, airport, the 2 industrial districts, conservancy, parks and recreation, and campus institutional. Again, happy to get in some of the details of those, but those are really the least likely to be influenced by BRT overlay for a variety of reasons, such as campus institutional. The main area along BRT influenced by that zoning is the UW, and they have a campus master plan that's already adopted, so providing additional bonuses or benefits or carrots and sticks wouldn't necessarily make sense with respect to that zoning. So this map shows that BRT line again with a quarter mile and half mile buffer. This brings in the local and National Register historic districts. National Register is shown in the orange hash marks. The local historic districts are shown in that solid teal color. And then as we bring in the parcels within a quarter mile of BRT line that fit the criteria of excluding historic districts, excluding those other zoning districts that I mentioned, and excluding the downtown, we end up with just over 5,000 parcels totaling almost 1,800 acres that would be influenced by TOD overlay zoning within a quarter mile of this BRT line. Of those, about 1,400 parcels totaling 307 acres are single-family zoning. So as we look at potential adjustments that could come into play for underlying zoning with this TOD overlay, things that we've looked at as staff are changes to permitted, conditional, and prohibited use lists, increased dwelling unit counts, increased residential densities, increased building height, a minimum building height, which is very infrequently applied in our many current zoning districts, reduced setbacks, reduced parking minimums, and reduced parking maximums. And so looking at this with respect to some example zoning districts and a fair amount of detail here, just have 2 of these example zoning districts, but I could certainly pull in many more. For the traditional shopping street district, TSS zoning, the existing criteria regulations are shown on the left. Potential TOD overlay is shown on the right. And so for permitted uses under the TOD overlay, right now this kind of first draft or first cut for discussion would add permitted use of 25 to 36 unit multifamily buildings, adding a conditional use for public parking facilities, And then have a fairly substantial list of prohibited uses that would be present under TOD overlay. Most of them auto-oriented, such as auto body shops and gas stations, convenience stores, as well as some larger scale agricultural uses. Then conditional use height threshold for many of these zoning districts, including TSS, we would potentially adjust that threshold to add a bit of additional height within proximity to major transit corridors. No change in lot area requirements, minimum parking requirements. The change would be to have no minimum for TOD areas and also no option to exceed the maximum. So right now there are certain options to do that through conditional uses, but those would be eliminated, and no change to setbacks. And so looking at those TSS parcels, those are shown in red on this map. And so in the case of TSS, there are 111 parcels totaling 29 acres that would be impacted by these adjustments within that quarter mile of the BRT line. Looking at a second example, focusing on traditional residential consistent 1, TRC1 zoning. The changes in this instance are a little less substantial. Permitted uses would add 2-unit structures. So that might in some respects feel nominal, but it is kind of a doubling of what's possible on these parcels in terms of residential density. No change in conditional uses, prohibited uses. The 2-unit just shifts to permitted, so otherwise no change. No change in maximum height, bringing in a lot area requirement for 2-unit. Parking requirements, same as TSS in terms of no minimum and no option to exceed the maximum, then potentially allowing for slightly less of a setback for this zoning district. So in this example, TRC1 zoning, there are 307 parcels totaling 78 acres within a quarter mile of the planned BRT line, really focusing again within 2 areas along the BRT line, is circled in red here. And so those are the kind of 2 in-depth examples looking at those zoning districts. We also have a number of kind of case study areas as well, with several examples to go with each case study area. So for these case study areas, we're looking at a few parcels around Mineral Point Road at Westtown, a couple of parcels in that example area 2 along Sheboygan Avenue, some parcels along East Washington Avenue, area 3, and then some parcels close to Union Corners and Milwaukee Street on the near east side as well. And so zooming in on this area, I have 2 examples in this particular Mineral Point Road corridor. Parcel A, kind of outlined or highlighted in purple there, looks at an existing auto service station, commercial area, and then parcel B in the upper right corner looks at a single family home to the north of Mineral Point Road. So looking at the respective zoning for these areas, this parcel A is in the midst of a largely CC commercial center district area that includes adjoining Westtown Mall, and then SRC1 is prevalent in that parcel B area. So zooming in a little bit to look at this existing auto service station, as I mentioned, and looking at this commercial center zoning, permitted uses are shown in the column on the left there. Conditional uses on the column on the right. Currently allowable is that top row. Commercial employment uses are allowable, multifamily and single family attached are conditional right now, and then maximum of 5 stories and 78 feet is permitted. Under TOD overlay, we would look at disallowing, I guess you could say, auto-oriented commercial uses within that quarter mile, bumping up the maximum height, adding potentially multifamily as a permitted use up to 36 dwelling units, as well as single family attached to permitted use. And then seeing adjoining or related adjustments and conditional uses. I would mention and note for this area in particular, just had the Odan area plan adopted this past September. This area is noted as potential proactive rezoning to regional mixed use. And so I've noted what that would mean if that proactive rezoning happens as far as permitted uses in the in this currently commercial center area, which would be even a step up from the TOD overlay in commercial center. So for all of these site examples, we've also looked at what this means with respect to underlying plans. So for the Odan area plan, as I mentioned, a regional mixed use land use shown for this area, no maximum residential density associated, maximum height of 12 stories, and that proactive rezoning recommendation to regional mixed use zoning within the Odan area plan. Comprehensive plan is consistent with those recommendations. Site B within this example area 1, SRC1 zoning, essentially as a single family district, currently allowable as single family detached dwelling under TOD overlay, a pretty simple change, 2-family dwelling, both twin and 2-unit styles would be allowed under TOD overlay. There's no neighborhood or area plan for this particular part of the city. The comprehensive plan shows this as low residential. So the comp plan describes as up to 15 units an acre, and for this example parcel, which is about a 1/4 acre, that would allow, under the comp plan's future land use density recommendations, 4 dwelling units at 15 dwelling units per acre. But under the TOD overlay, that would still be limited to 2 dwelling units. For the example number 2 area, we're looking at Sheboygan Avenue. Both of these examples to the north of Sheboygan, one of them is residential, existing apartment building, other one being employment, the Red Cross site. Zoning for this area, SRV2 for the residential area and SE for the Red Cross site, the employment area. And then also showing for these areas where historic districts are present. And so as you can see, obviously a larger historic district, National Register Historic District for Hill Farms immediately to the south of Sheboygan. So zooming in on that Site A example, this is currently a 16-unit building. Permitted uses allow up to 24 units under TOD overlay. For many of these residential zoning districts, we're looking at allowing the next highest increment of residential intensity. So in this case, that would be permitting residential development of 25 to 60 units in that category for SRV2 zoning. So looking at the neighborhood plans and comprehensive plans plan for this area, University Hill Farms, which was adopted in 2016, called for high density residential in this particular parcel of 41 plus units per acre, 4 to 6 story buildings, and then has some even more detailed recommendations for this particular block, calling for up to 200 residential units for what is block B in this particular plan. The comp plan, pretty much consistent with that University Hill Farms plan, calls for medium residential, 20 to 90 units an acre, 2 to 5 stories. And then I just note here that the size of the site allows for 54 dwelling units if we assume that it's developed for 90 dwelling units an acre. So the TOD overlay would really bring zoning kind of into compliance with what the plans or underlying plans are recommending for this area. For the second example, on Sheboygan Avenue, Site B, this is an employment site, suburban employment, allows for a variety of different employment uses, maximum height of 5 stories. Some auto-oriented uses are allowed as conditional uses, as are multifamily dwellings and taller buildings as well. Under TOD overlay, auto-oriented uses would be prohibited. There would be a height bonus as well, and then a 2-story minimum height would come into play, which does impact employment in some of these areas along the BRT corridor. University Hill Farms neighborhood plan calls for employment in this area. The site concept, the detailed site concept included in that plan shows for expansion of Red Cross, and actually it shows a potential addition of multifamily dwelling units along Sheboygan. Calls for 3 to 6 story development on this block. And in the comprehensive plan, there is no height or residential density limits for employment areas. So continuing on to the examples that we have in the East Isthmus area. I have 2 examples in this area as well, an employment example again, and a residential development example with different zoning districts though. So looking at zoning and nearby historic districts, Site A is traditional employment, and then Site B is TRV1 zoning. Zooming in on that Site A example, for traditional employment, again, a variety of employment uses are allowed. Some auto-oriented uses are conditional, as are multifamily dwellings. Employment and those uses would continue to be allowed with the exception of prohibiting auto-oriented uses. There would be, again, that height bump as well as the height minimum. And multifamily dwellings would continue to be conditional within employment. There are a few overlying plans within this area as far as neighborhood plans. There's the Capital Gateway Corridor Plan, calls for employment residential for this Site A along East Washington Avenue. No maximum residential density, maximum height of 8 stories for the bulk of the site. And the site is also an Urban Design District 8, so those regulations would be in play as well. The Tenney-Lapham Neighborhood Plan generally is consistent with that Capital Gateway Corridor Plan. It's called for employment with a TOD overlay, which allows for some flexibility to bring in some of those mix of uses. No maximum residential density and the same maximum heights as Capital Gateway Corridor. And then the comp plan, consistent with other, as I mentioned previously, employment uses have no residential or residential density limits or height limits, excuse me. Site B example, currently allowable under traditional residential varied 1 district is up to 4 unit multifamily dwellings. The current building in this particular example is a single family dwelling. Height limits are 3 stories, 40 feet. Conditional uses, there are no residential family living conditional uses that are allowed in this particular district. Under a TOD overlay, it again would take that approach of allowing the next highest increment of residential intensity. So in that case, it would allow for 5 to 8 unit multifamily and attached single family development. It would maintain the 3-story maximum height, but also implement that 2-story minimum. And so this is an interesting example with respect to the neighborhood plan. Tenney-Lapham in this instance calls for low density residential for this particular area. It's kind of a 2-block cutout within Tenney-Lapham that calls for LDR, low density residential style development in the midst of higher residential intensities, medium residential intensities. So in this case, it's 0 to 15 units an acre for that low density residential. And this particular parcel example has about 8,500 square feet on that lot, which would allow for 3 units under that density range. The comprehensive plan follows or mimics the Tenney-Lapham plan and calls for up to 15 units an acre. So this is an instance where if TOD overlay is implemented as currently drawn up in this first draft or first cut for discussion, that would potentially allow for intensities that are above and beyond what the neighborhood plan allows for this particular area of Tenney-Lapham. Example number 4, area number 4. I have 3 examples in the Eakin Park and Shank-Atwood, Starkweather-Yahara area, A, B, and C. Example A is in a neighborhood mixed use zoning district. B is in TRC4 zoning, and then C is in a CCT zoning up close to the river there along East Washington Avenue. So for that site A, neighborhood mixed use, currently allowable up to 12 units for a purely residential building and up to 24 units for a mixed use building. Maximum height of 3 stories. And then those conditional uses allow exceeding those permitted densities as a conditional use. Some auto-oriented uses are allowed as conditional uses in an NMX zoning. And so under the TOD overlay, this as well would allow that next highest increment of residential intensity. So it would take it up to 24 units as a purely residential building, up to 48 units as a mixed use building. Would step up the potential maximum height as well, and then bring into play that minimum height. And then again, prohibit auto-oriented uses. Comparing to the in place Emerson Eakin Park Yahara neighborhood plan, calls for neighborhood mixed use in this area as well, but there are no height or density recommendations. So zoning in the comprehensive plan would provide additional guidance. Comp plan calls for neighborhood mixed use, which in general in the comp plan is up to 70 units an acre and up to 4 stories. Site B within this example area 4 is a residential, existing residential structure under TRC 4 zoning. A single family, 2 family, and 3 family is allowed. I believe this example is currently single family. Under TOD zoning, that next highest increment is allowing a 4-unit multifamily building. No change to the maximum height. This particular part of the city is covered by the Darbo-Worthington Starkweather neighborhood plan. There are a few other overlapping plans that were adopted far prior to that I haven't compared it to, since Darbo was much more recently adopted. That plan calls for low density residential in this area, up to 8 dwelling units per acre. In the case of this particular parcel, that would be 1.6 units. There is a note within this neighborhood plan that this particular area should have preservation and rehabilitation of the existing single family and 2 family character, with no lot assemblage and discouraging demolition of existing structures. So this is kind of another instance where potentially TOD zoning would have a bit of a bump to the allowable density that is not in strict compliance, certainly with the existing neighborhood plan for this area. And then the comprehensive plan, just the standard low residential specifications for this area. And our final example before we get to Q&A and discussion, and I guess public testimony as well, is looking at Eakin Park, Sassy neighborhood. Again, with this example 4, site C, this commercial corridor transitional zoning. Multifamily in a purely residential allows up to 36 units. In a mixed use building allows up to 60 dwelling units, with conditional uses allowed to exceed both of those, with additional dwelling units. Maximum height 5 stories, 78 feet. Under TOD overlay, there would be that bump to allow additional dwelling units for multifamily residential. Have a typo in this. It would go up to that next allowable intensity. So I believe that's up to 60 units for purely multifamily residential buildings. For mixed use building, really the 60 unit threshold is a substantial line. So might have to generate a new category if we want to maintain that differential between allowing for a certain threshold for purely residential buildings versus mixed use buildings, which I think was something that the council wanted to maintain a difference to kind of encourage mixed use between those 2 categories. Then allow a bump up to 6 stories instead of maximum of 5. So this area in Emerson Eakin Park, Yahara is general commercial. The comprehensive plan actually shifted this to community mixed use to allow for more intense and mixed use development along portions of East Washington Avenue. So that would allow for residential really to come into play for this at up to 130 dwelling units per acre and up to 6 stories. So with that, we have a series of questions for the Plan Commission. I can recap and run through those right now, or we can take them one by one. And then obviously also there's a public testimony. And so I don't know if we want to switch over to that right now and come back to these questions. So I'll just leave it up to the commission to make that decision.
Why don't we go ahead and get the public testimony, and then we will get questions of staff, and then we'll move on to the discussion questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Ben. The first registrant, as I mentioned, is Michael Lawton, District 11, Eau Claire Avenue, opposed and wishing to speak representing Hill Farms Association. Michael, you have 3 minutes.
All right, thank you. Just a few comments tonight on this. First of all, the National Register District, I appreciate that the proposal from staff appears to be to leave the National Register area out. It would be great if there could be some kind of affirmative statement or consensus from the members on that. I spent an hour and a half this morning with the federal, local, and state people on the Section 106 analysis for the bus rapid transit line, and it will vastly simplify their task if the National Register District at Hill Farms is left out of the TOD zoning, because otherwise they're going to have to analyze it as if it is, and as if it would actually be implemented, and that would have adverse effects on the district. So I would hope that there could be some discussion of that and sort of a consensus to leave that out. So hopefully that can be set aside. Other things I wanted to comment on, outreach. This could have some significant impacts across the city. So I hope that there's some significant outreach done to various neighborhoods around the city. I've been involved for our neighborhood, so I kind of know what's going on, but I suspect there could be a surprise from some of this with other neighborhoods in the city. So I hope you do a good outreach job on that. And then lastly, with regard to the Hill Farms area along Sheboygan Avenue, that seems to be the one area, the north side of Sheboygan, which is in our neighborhood, which is not in the historical district area, that would be affected by this proposal. And Ben did a good job of pointing out a couple of properties. I would discourage adopting anything that would suggest that some of the commercial areas like the Red Cross area are going to be now wide open to residential. I don't think that's good policy, really. I think you want to encourage and preserve some of those areas as commercial employment areas. If some of them have big parking lots, might be good for future additions, expansions, new buildings. There's a huge vacant parcel that goes with the Red Cross, for example. I don't think you want somebody just throwing in a large multifamily building in there without considering the impacts on the employment potential for that district, which is going to be served by the bus line. And then for any apartments on the north side of Sheboygan, again, I would stick with the current zoning and deal with it on a case-by-case basis. I think that's the best way to adhere to the comp plan that was adopted for our amendment to the comp plan that consists of our neighborhood plan. It was just adopted a few years ago to put a new overlay zoning on some of those parcels. I think you then need to revisit the neighborhood plan in order to have the zoning be consistent with the comp plan under the smart growth statute. So you might be better just leaving those alone and just dealing with them on a case-by-case basis. That's not to say that some of those properties shouldn't be rejuvenated or rehabilitated, but I think they can be handled on a case-by-case basis as we do now.
Thank you, Michael. That concludes your available time. The next registrant is Kurt Steggy, 82 Cambridge Road, Madison, neither support nor oppose and wishing to speak. Kurt, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm here to ask, I guess, a couple of questions. One is, why do we have historic districts? And I think there are some very good answers. They are vestiges of a time. They reflect what people could build and chose to build at that time. They're a tangible way to associate with a period of history. Historic districts represent less than 2% of Madison's land parcels. These small areas of the city have a great deal to teach us. If we don't treat them differently than other areas, they will not continue to exist. They have been specifically singled out for protection from change, and to now carve out areas of these districts in order to encourage highly visible change is antithetical to the entire concept of historic preservation. Historic districts are immobile assets. They aren't literature or music that are inherently mobile. By definition, historical districts cease to exist in a different location. Why would someone want to encourage development in a national park? Finally, I'd simply say that there is no basis for drawing any distinction between local, state, and national historic districts. All were created for the same purpose. All are entitled to the same protections. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kurt. The final registrant wishing to speak is Bob Kleba, East Gorham, neither support nor oppose. Bob, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Zellers. This is not my first presentation on transit-oriented development. In 1974, our ninth grade class took a train to Toronto, and we heard an urban planner talk about transit-oriented development overlay districts as a function of their growing transit system there. So I am, and I can say as a kid, having spent a lot of time in Europe and particularly in France, there's a concept of satellite cities which were developed.
Bob, you were muted there.
Sorry, I'm on my phone. I got a phone call.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Anyway, the and watched how these satellite cities. As a young adult, I worked in one of these satellite cities and watched how it developed as a function of the rapidly growing transit available to that satellite city. So I want to impress on the commission how long-term these overlay districts will be. And I wrote comments to the commission about my concerns with the increasing density on the isthmus and protection of the national historic districts. And just I really commend the work that you're doing here, and I want to impress on you how long-term this work will be. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. The other 2 registrants are not available to answer questions and do not wish to speak. So are there questions by plan commissioners of any of our registrants? Seeing no raised hands, we will move on to questions of staff and discussion and comments. Are there questions of staff? Commissioner Fernandez.
Thank you. I have probably kind of a rookie question for staff. I'm a relatively green plan commission member, but there's a lot of discussion in the zones all have like maximum number of units. The comprehensive plans have dwelling units per acre. Those 2 don't match up in my mind. could you talk a little bit? I mean, one could permit 60 units instead of 30 units, but without the denominator of the area of the land, neither of those directly results in any different density. So how is density reflected in number of units?
It looks like Heather wants to take that question. Heather?
Sure, I can start, and then if Colin or Ben want to chime in too. So I think in our zoning code today, density is really best addressed through the minimum lot area requirement per unit. And you'll find that in all of the residential zoning districts, the multifamily residential districts down to the lower density residential districts. And so I think in general, what we're proposing with this group of boosts or changes would be, if your parcel lies within X distance, quarter mile of the BRT line, basically the allowable density, you would graduate to the kind of the next tier up with regard to number of units and allowable density. And so I think in short, the answer to your question is that density is directly related to our zoning code with regard to residential districts. But I want to say also that when we get into the mixed use and commercial districts, our code doesn't directly address density. For a mixed use building with 40 units, 60 units, we don't have strict density limitations in our zoning code today. Now we do have height limitations. And so right now, the way that we're crafting this, initial proposal would be in mixed use districts where currently today you could have a 3-story building by right. Perhaps if you're in a TOD overlay district, you could then do a 4-story building by right. And that height really in the zoning code kind of serves as a proxy for density. It's not perfect by any means, because of course the acreage is really what drives the density calculation. But I think what Ben showed and we tried to pull together is a look that while we want to admit upfront that, if we move with this sort of citywide paradigm to provide boosts by zoning district, we may not perfectly match all of the recommendations and adopted plans, but we're going to come really close. And I think the guidance in the comprehensive plan related to allowing slightly greater densities along high capacity transit routes really provides the policy guidance to allow this to happen. Again, will it be perfectly consistent with all of our adopted plans in all cases? No. And I think Ben showed a few examples where it actually does diverge. I think the question for policymakers is that okay? Should we be overlooking some slight imperfections in order to provide these boosts near the main transit corridors? Does that get to your question?
It really does, Heather. And what I didn't realize and now do is that in a residential district, you have a minimum lot area. So therefore, if you have a maximum number of units, you have an implied density. What might help me sometimes is to say that when you're talking about the zoning district, I was having trouble relating 36 versus 60 units to come over here to the comprehensive plan and say so many dwelling units per acre, because the minimum acreage of that zoning category was not there. So I can make that calculation for myself, I guess, but that might be helpful for me to just make sure, are you proposing doubling the density? Are you proposing increasing it by 5%? I couldn't make that judgment, but thanks. You really explained it for me very well.
And that's really helpful to us as staff to know that would be helpful to the commission to bring back in the next iteration. So we'll be sure to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Fernandez. Did you have any further questions?
No, that was really helpful to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alder Heck.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of questions to start off. I'm wondering if maybe, Heather, you can do this to just give us a refresher on, when there is an overlay like this versus the zoning ordinance. And, I'm used to hearing that if there's a conflict, whichever is the most restrictive of the ordinance might be the one that's applied. And I think in some of the examples I saw, there were still some conflicts in the overlay versus the zoning district. Maybe I'm wrong, but I thought I saw that. So maybe you can address what happens when there is a conflict. And then my other question would be related to non-conforming uses. And it seems we'd be potentially creating some non-conforming situations, maybe a great deal of them, and maybe just a quick review of what that means. and when properties sell, how a non-conforming use is treated, and what does the future hold for parcels that have non-conforming uses based on the TOD overlay?
Heather, I think that question was directed to you. Can you respond?
Sure. Great questions. I'll start with the non-conforming. Well, no, I'll start with the overlay in general and kind of a quick overview of what an overlay is. And let me provide a simple example. In Madison, we have wellhead protection overlay districts. And so in the vicinity of one of our city wells, even if a property lies within an industrial zoning district where a very wide range of uses are possible, within the wellhead protection district, there's a list of prohibited uses that may contaminate our city's groundwater. And so in those cases, the more restrictive overlay list of land uses would trump, I guess, for lack of a better term, the underlying list of allowable uses. So that's that example. I think in this case, while the concept is still similar, it's a little bit different because what we're doing in some cases is directly increasing the development capacity. So we're making it less restrictive by providing a boost within the overlay itself. And so, if a property lies within a certain base zoning district and finds themselves, within a quarter mile of the BRT route, all of a sudden that property would be functionally like zoned base zoning district with a TOD, dash TOD. So it would have a different set of development possibilities, different set of uses. So it's similar. I think it's a little bit similar to, it's not the same as our urban design districts, but it's similar to them in that, it's working in tandem with the base zoning. But I think the best way to look at TOD zoning overlay is that it would provide a modification, an instant modification to the development capacity of a particular property, and also to the list of uses, particularly around auto-oriented uses. And so I hope that helps. I'm not sure I'm eloquently describing that, but if anyone else wants to.
Yeah, before we move on to his next question, Alder Heck, did that answer that question?
Yes, that was helpful. I mean, I kind of had some of that answer in my head, but I think you kind of clarified that in it. I guess that's something I feel like we need to keep in our minds as we go through this. About this is kind of a unique overlay in that it's not less restrictive. I mean, maybe there are portions of urban design districts that are also above and beyond the base zoning. So maybe that is a good analogy. That was helpful.
Do any other staff have anything to add to what Heather said? Don't see any, so Heather.
Okay, with regard to non-conforming uses, then I think that is an issue that we need to grapple with as a city with regard to the development of this overlay. If we do create a list of new prohibited uses within a certain distance of our transit routes, in many cases we will be creating non-conforming uses. And so maybe one example would be, a gas station. that lies along a transit corridor. Now, of course, as many of you know and are familiar with, once a use is non-conforming, it can continue in perpetuity. But if that use were to go away for a period of 12 months, at least 12 months, it couldn't be reestablished on that site. And so, the rights to that use are there unless it goes away for a period of 12 months, and then it would not be able to be reestablished. And so, importantly, sometimes that does impact the insurance, the sale environment for property. I would imagine that, folks wanting to purchase a gas station along a transit corridor may think twice because they may look at, well, I'm purchasing a non-conforming use. Our understanding from this recently, when we looked into this with residential uses, is that it can be a little bit messy. I think that different banks view non-conforming uses a little bit differently. And so I don't want to understate the importance of considering the creation of many non-conformities.
Just one quick follow-up, thanks. And then you mentioned the 1-year period that needs to expire before a non-conforming use is still valid. And that's without regard to who owns the property. You can sell it, and that conditional use travels with the property, correct?
Correct, yes.
Or that non-conforming use, sorry, it's not a conditional use. Okay, thank you. That answered my question.
Did you have any further questions, Alder Heck? No. Okay, thank you. Commissioner Shepard.
Hi, and I apologize if you've already discussed the issue of sort of timelines regarding the TOD, but Bob brought up, the registrant brought up the question about how this would evolve over time. Could staff talk a little bit about that? Because right now we're still in sort of the planning stage, then we're going to go into sort of adoption, and then there'll be, once again, sort of the long term. Can you talk a little bit about, again, about the process? Because I think for anyone just sort of peeking in and listening to this, they may get the impression that this is sort of a one-shot deal. A decision will be made and that will be it. And I think Bob was trying to make the point that with this TOD, this is going to be a long-term project that will evolve over time. Any comments? Thank you.
Whichever staff want to take that, do you want to raise your hand? It looks like Heather.
I'll start, and I'm not trying to talk too much, sorry. I think that I'm going to take that in two pieces. So first, there's the process piece. How are we going to work as a team to develop the transit-oriented development overlay zoning? And then it's really what I heard the registrant talking about was more the duration of the implementation, that this has long-term implications for the build out of, I think in the case that they were speaking to, it's really the region, looking at satellite cities, probably along a much more high capacity transit route than bus rapid transit within one municipality. But I think we as planners and you as commissioners are certainly always thinking about that long term. What are the long-term implications? How long will it take to see the build out of the policies that we're working on together today? And that can certainly take decades to really see the build out of that. But I think if done well, and if the investment, the massive investment in transit and the allowance of more development capacity near that transit can work hand in hand together to make that transit more successful, to provide more ridership from residents and job opportunities near the transit stations. But as far as the process is concerned, I know that we've gotten right into some details because we wanted to dive in and provide some realistic examples of the framework, that the way that we thought this could work. And I think that sometimes it's important for you all to see specific sites and how the policy changes might affect those sites. I still consider us very early in this process. I think we'll be working on it through much of 2022. But we don't want to be working on this for years and years, because the bus rapid transit system should be up and running, at least on this east-west corridor, by 2024. And we want to provide that land use framework and the signals that were supportive of greater development intensities near the transit route, so that some of those projects can get underway as bus rapid transit it is also being constructed. I think we have several months ahead of us of refining the details, coming back to Plan Commission, importantly, as one of the registrants mentioned, doing the necessary outreach in the community related to this. I think what's important at this point is finding out, well, what's our framework? So that it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. We want to know how best to take this out to the community by getting some consensus around the big picture pieces of it.
Thank you.
Commissioner Shepard, did that answer your questions, number one? And did you have anything else that you wanted to ask?
Everything answered. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Cantrell.
Yes, my question deals with one of the examples that staff had, and it was in the Tenny Lampin area. And I know that Ben said that the TOD would be pretty significantly different than what the plan would allow. And I guess if he could go over that example again, and it was actually a residential example, and it was the number of units that the plan and existing zoning would allow versus what the TOD would allow the increase in density.
Ben, can you maybe share screen again and answer that question?
Yes, let me scroll back over to that example just a second here. So actually, maybe I'll just kind of back up slightly to give the surrounding context. There we go. So this is Site B on this third example area, which is in TRV1 zoning currently. Fast forward through that example. And so this is a existing single family home in this TRV1 zoning. TRV1 zoning allows up to 4-unit multifamily dwelling under that zoning category. Under TOD overlay, the theme's been kind of allowing that next level increment of intensity, residential intensity. So that next level increment is the 5 to 8 unit multifamily.
Okay.
And height limit would remain the same, but then Tenny Lapham neighborhood plan shows this particular area as low density residential at up to 15 units an acre. And so that's about an 8,500 square foot lot, which in this case is actually a double lot, really the way the block was platted, which would allow a maximum of, really, if we're rounding up by 1/10 of a unit, 3 units. So in some cases, actually, in this LDR area, the existing zoning allows for more than the Tenny Lapham neighborhood plan calls for. So the TOD overlay would potentially bring it, even a little bit further from that compliance. And the comprehensive plan is consistent with that Tenny Lapham recommendation.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
That answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you for explaining that further.
Did you have any further questions?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alder Heck.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed Alder Foster had his hand raised too. Do you want to get the commission's questions?
I want to get the commissions, and then I will definitely loop Alder Foster in.
All right. I have a couple questions with regard to, I guess, historic preservation in general.
It looks like Alder Heck has frozen. So while he is hopefully working that out, we
assuming
will.
that
Alder Heck,
can you hear me?
can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, my connection is unstable, so I'll leave my camera off if that works.
Okay.
With regard to historic preservation, I'm interested in understanding how this could impact, in your mind, staff's mind, some of the recommendations in the historic preservation plan about exploring, even doing studies to document historic resources in particular areas, and in potentially pursuing some form of designation as a local or national district or not. Would the fact that an overlay exists, do you think, squelch some of those recommended actions in the historic preservation plan?
I'm looking for, okay, it looks like Heather again. Heather.
Sorry about that. I guess I don't think so. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
And so let me try to restate the question. You're thinking something that's not a designated landmark, for instance, today, or that's not a local historic district today, would the fact that that property is in a TOD overlay cause the city to no longer consider that area for future historic designation? Okay, I don't think so. I think that if a property is a worthwhile landmark site, for instance, that work could definitely continue, and the presence of the TOD overlay, surrounding it, I don't think would have any impact on whether or not it moved forward as a landmark for designation. And of course, if it did, any changes to that site then would need to be reviewed and approved by the city's Landmarks Commission. So I think what the TOD overlay does is it simply would change the permitting process in many ways to allow for greater intensities to come about through redevelopment as a permitted use rather than a conditional use. But for our historic resources, so anything in a local historic district or a landmark, just the demolition of those buildings is a very high bar and very rare. I think rarely does the Landmarks Commission and then the Plan Commission approve demolition of what exists there today.
Thanks. Just a follow-up then. Let's say that by some miraculous occurrence, we do establish a new local historic district that's within the TOD overlay. That would require kind of kicking that area out of the existing TOD overlay.
I think that's a really good point. So yeah, I think that could be the mechanics of how that would occur. Like they can't coexist on one piece of land. And so if something becomes a local historic district, perhaps it's no longer eligible in the TOD overlay. I think that could be an outcome. I also think it would be good to have that clarified in the ordinance.
Mm-hmm.
I guess currently, even without regard to a TOD overlay, if there were to be an area declared a local historic district or a local landmark, that same consideration occurs now. It all of a sudden trumps whatever the underlying zoning is. So maybe it's not so different. Thanks. That helped me think that through.
Sure.
Thank you, Alder Heck. Any further questions? No. Okay. Commissioner Solheim.
Thank you. Quick question. A number of, or maybe all of the overlay district examples talked about how auto-oriented uses would be excluded. Is that a specific definition in our zoning code? I'm just curious how narrow or broad that is.
Ben or Colin, do you have a response to that? Colin.
There are some that are specifically called out, but I think Ben and I spent some time combing through the uses. There are some that are specifically, I think they're vehicle related. There's a category, but then there are some additional uses as well that fall under other categories that we had to identify specifically.
Okay. And then quick question, one of the speakers mentioned this, but I'm familiar with the 106 review. So I'm just kind of curious about the mechanics of that and how the conversations came about with the National Historic Districts. Is there a sense that this TOD overlay could be considered part of the federal BRT project and that therefore impacts the 106 review, or kind of how did that come about, that concern?
Colin or Ben or Heather? Oh, here, Tom Lynch. Yeah. Tom Lynch, please go ahead.
Yeah, so we are in the middle of the NEPA, which is the environmental document phase for the BRT. Mm-hmm. And part of that includes the Section 106 evaluation. So the bus rapid transit and the TOD overlay are separate actions, and we maintain that they're separate actions. One's kind of, they're kind of originating from different parts of the city, and they have different purpose and needs. However, by omitting the historic, national, as well as local historic districts, it clarifies the discussion of 106 in our environmental documents. We are very clear. We can say, well, this is our impact for our 32 stations. But if the TOD overlay happens, then all of a sudden there's perhaps an indirect effect that becomes less clear in our environmental document. And we want, while we maintain that they're separate actions, we want to be clear on what is the effect of the BRT and what is the effect of your actions, if you know what I mean, that there's a clear definition of that. Now, that being said, this does not preclude the Planning Commission from approving higher densities in areas that are not inside the TOD. If for instance, there is some just really good example of a higher and better use for something that is not in a TOD zone, that's fully, within the Plan Commission's authority to approve that. And so we don't want to take away that authority that you rightfully have kind of as stewards of how the city develops. But we do want to provide clarity of effects in our environmental document. And as we present, what is the BRT and what is TOD to the public, so that as they evaluate the effects.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I was mostly asking, from our prior meeting, I remember having a discussion particularly about the Hill Farm National District, which is very large, but I know from recent projects that we've seen that there's also a pretty robust area plan that kind of contemplates future redevelopment in areas that are appropriate in that neighborhood. So it certainly leaves opportunities in that sense. So that's all I have for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Next is Commissioner Cantrell.
Just a quick question, and Commissioner Soltheim kind of sparked this question. What triggers a auto-orientated use? Does a drive-up window? And specifically, there's lots of uses that have drive-up windows. Walgreens, some clinics do, obviously banks do. restaurants. So would all those uses be precluded because they have a drive-up window and it allows more of an auto-oriented use?
Ben?
So, I mean, drive-throughs are considered auto-oriented uses the way we're describing them. So a bank with a drive-through would not be allowed, just a bank would be allowed. So we're kind of using auto-oriented uses as a blanket term and describing this instead of going through the kind of the laundry list of specific things that relates to that. But yeah, so I mean, it just generally drive-throughs, convenience stores, gas stations, auto repair, auto, like taxi company, places of service, those kinds of things are all kind of under that umbrella of auto-oriented uses. So they're not necessarily all found within the same exact place of the zoning code.
So Walgreens would fall into that area if it had a drive-up window.
The drive-through portion of a pharmacy.
Okay.
Yes.
We'll have to talk about that during our discussion on the ordinance. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you.
I think Colin also maybe had a point or two to go parallel with that.
Please go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, if I'm able to share my screen, I can point out just in the code how these are described. So this is the use table for mixed use and commercial districts. So we have automobile services, which includes auto repair, sales and rental, car washes, things like that. There are also parking facilities, some transportation uses as well. And if I, go all the way down to the bottom to accessory uses and structures, this includes things like vehicle sales, vehicle access sales and service windows, which, as you know, is a drive up. So while we can identify some of those larger categories, we may need to discuss in more detail some of the specific uses, like a drive-through window.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Yep. Commissioner Fernandez.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to just cycle back a little bit to the 106 question with Tom and make sure I understand, because Tom, I think, is saying what I would understand, which is that the bus rapid transit, the project on which federal funds is going to be spent, is not the transit overlay district, that the two are separate. And if I understand correctly, Tom, you're saying, though, that just even having them in close proximity complicates the environmental document, but we don't really have a judgment right now that the federal government would consider a transit overlay district to be impairing an historic property, and I say it also mindful of the fact that even if the TOD district were to apply to the National Register district, whatever historic preservation requirements would still be in place. I mean, if anyone were to actually impact spend federal funds to impact the view shed of a contributing resource or something like that, it would have to go through a 106 review. So, yeah, I'm feeling a little bit that this 106 is like a third rail that we don't even want to get close to. But I think it probably deserves a little more discussion. So maybe this is more of an opinion, but Tom, am I correct that you would say, though, that for your purposes, you wouldn't say absolutely the TOD district must exclude National Register districts?
Tom?
Yeah, so we are in regular discussion with the FTA on this issue, and we are soon to be submitting materials to the State Historical Preservation Officer. And I think I think we just want to be clear what is a BRT 106 effect and what is not a BRT 106 effect. And if the TOD includes historic preservation, historic districts, then even they are separate actions, and we maintain that they are separate actions, but others, there are others that will feel that they are actions together.
Right, okay.
And then our BRT project really then becomes put on the same time frame as the TOD project, right? And so now that being said, I'm making a recommendation to provide clarity to our environmental document, to our section 106 document. I do want to defer to the Plan Commission that you have the authority to change your requirements, change the overlay zoning, and perhaps, I don't know when, the timeline for your implementation of the TOD zoning. You can, you are stewards of how we develop Madison, and you can approve higher densities, or you can change your TOD ordinance, in the future, or, you can do many things. Right now, to provide clarity in our environmental documentation and our section 106 submittals, it's useful to the approving agencies to fully or clearly understand what is a bus rapid transit impact and what is a transit-oriented design impact.
Commissioner Fernandez, was that helpful?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very much.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Alder Lemmer.
Thank you. I've got two questions. This first one is driven by curiosity much more than any concern. I'm just wondering if we know how many auto-oriented commercial businesses are currently in the potential TOD overlay zone that would become non-conforming uses?
Ben.
That's a quick answer. We have not looked at that. So don't know the number. I mean, I would guess it would be fairly substantial. There are, many gas stations along the way. There are drive-through pharmacies and banks along the route. So I'm guessing it would probably be over 100. That's just my, personal guess.
Colin.
Yeah, I was myself going to say a lot, but I think if we are concerned about creating uses where we're concerned there will be issues in the future, I think there are ways that we can mitigate that. I was thinking about drive-throughs, for instance, in the NMX and TSS districts. Drive-throughs are a conditional use, but they have to be within or under a building. They can't just be set on the side like in some districts. So if we are concerned about eliminating them altogether, we could look at situations like that.
Okay, cool.
Thank you, Colin. Did you have any other questions, Alder Lemmer?
Yeah, I was just wondering if we could get a list of the various auto-oriented uses compiled and provided. Like, I guess I wouldn't have thought of the drive up at a pharmacy as an auto-oriented use, although it makes sense. It just wouldn't have occurred to me. It would be helpful to just see all of the different uses since they are in different parts of the zoning code.
Yes, I'm sure that staff can pull that together.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Heather, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, yes, we can pull that together. And I just want to reiterate that there can be more, much more back and forth about this. It's not that the Plan Commission has to choose all or auto-oriented uses prohibited versus none of them. I mean, there can be some iterations that we work on, but getting the Plan Commission that kind of full list to consider is a good next step. So we can do that next time.
Okay, thank you, Heather. Thank you, Alder Lemmer.
Right, thank you.
Alder Heck.
Thank you, and sorry to speak for a third time. I'm going to continue that line of questioning, and I'm thinking about all the recent auto-oriented accommodations, I'll call them, that we've made during the pandemic for pickup of food, delivery services, pre-pandemic and pandemic, that are all auto-oriented uses that may not be called out in the zoning code necessarily as uses. So that's something I'd be interested in thinking about too, because, you know, even car share and things like that are obviously auto-oriented uses, and there's more and more pressure to provide spaces, parking spaces for those in new developments and such. So I'd be interested to, I want to make sure we think about that as we talk about auto-oriented uses, because in many ways, research has shown that those are just as heinous as other auto-oriented uses in terms of CO2 emissions and things like that. So that it's not really a question, I guess, just kind of a statement that we need to think about that too.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alder Heck. Alder Foster. Thank you for being patient.
Of course, great discussion. A lot of my questions were already asked. I did want to follow up on one that a few folks talked about, which is this potential tension between the plans and the zoning code. So is the thinking right now to sort of solely focus on an ordinance in the zoning codes, or changing the district definitions and not do anything with the adopted plans?
That's a good question. I think that's something that staff have probably given some thought to. Heather?
Yeah, I do think that's an open question. I think, you know, we've shown some examples even just today on known inconsistencies that will come up. I think something I mentioned earlier is this overriding guidance within the comprehensive plan that would direct us to believe that one of the city's goals is to promote more transit-oriented development, and thus to allow more intensive development near transit routes. And we can dig more into the details on that, but I do think that at the end of the day, if this is the framework that we want to move forward with, we will have to kind of come to terms with that as city, and the decision makers will have to make that call that, you know, this really prevails. This overarching need for some more intensity prevails over the need for 100% consistency with adopted sub-area plans. And so I think just being forthright about that up front is important. I think, again, as we've looked at it as staff, we're very close. For instance, the comprehensive plan in our neighborhood mixed use areas recommends 2 to 4 stories. I don't think in any of the zoning districts related to that, we'd be looking at anything over 4 stories as a permitted use. So, you know, we've looked at some touch points on that, but can we say with 100% assurance that there's no inconsistency? No. So I think we need to grapple with that.
Did that answer your question, Alder Foster?
I think so. I see Colin has his hand up. I don't know if you wanted to add something.
Colin?
Yeah, I just wanted to just add one thing regarding the plan or the comprehensive plans recommendations. So kind of disregarding for the moment the special area plans. But the use, there are building form tables in the discussion portion of the generalized future land use map, where we talk about what's an appropriate building type for low residential or low medium residential or neighborhood mixed use. For several of those areas, we do include recommendation that along arterial roads and areas where there is good transit, that everything kind of gets bumped up a level of intensity. So that kind of idea that we are pushing more height, more density, more development along these important transportation corridors is already built into the actual generalized future land use map of the comprehensive plan as well.
Do you have any follow-ups, Alder Foster, or any additional questions?
Yeah, I did have a couple, and I guess just on that point, I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussion on it. My instinct at this point feels like, I mean, I know there's a cost to touch the comp plan, but it just feels like there might be some value in doing an addendum or something to get that in there. The question about transitioning of form. So do our current building form requirements that kind of talk about like stepping down heights, for example, to meeting like adjacent properties, would that still cover? Let me back up. So right now, the future land use recommendations and the current zoning districts have largely taken into account those adjacent properties. And if we end up kind of bumping up in terms of height, particularly, not so much number of units in my mind, but for height, for building form related things, will we still have similar sort of protections or requirements as it relates to stepping down, or will we potentially have more risk of a much taller building in between two very short buildings?
Heather.
I think that's a really good question. In what we've put together for this evening's discussion, staff hasn't looked at proposing any changes to those requirements regarding stepping down to adjacent residential buildings at the rear property line or side property line. So a really short answer would be no, that's not what we're recommending. But I think we could look into that in a little greater detail and make sure that makes sense.
Sounds great. Another question was, and this might be for Director Lynch or other DOT staff, but what's the thoughts of how this would interface with the TDM work that's, I think, close to getting finalized, especially related to parking requirements or other supports for transit use?
I think Philip's probably the best one to answer that. So Philip, why don't you go ahead and provide that answer?
We're not hearing you. Oh, there you go.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. So in short, we worked to line up some portions of the TDM program with this proposal. So, for instance, the buffer around the where TDM would receive enhanced points would be the quarter-mile buffer. So there's been consultation there. In terms of parking, parking reductions would actually help meet TDM requirements. So if a building, for instance, were to come in with no parking, as is allowable in some of the zoning districts within this plan, that would help them meet TDM requirements. It might actually mean that they don't have a TDM requirement. So there is an interface there. It would influence it. It depends on the level that they would pursue, the level of parking reduction.
So the primary connection point would be sort of consistency between the points that are required in TDM, a similar geography to what is perhaps being proposed for the TOD geography. So we're sort of requiring more TDM points, which could lead to parking reductions as one way to achieve those points.
Correct. Parking reduction is actually the easiest way to reduce TDM requirements. So even though in many of the areas that along the BRT corridor, there would be the highest requirement for TDM, parking reduction would minimize that and potentially even eliminate the TDM requirement.
Great, thank you. Another question was around sort of BRT versus high frequency or high capacity transits. Like the kind of words get used interchangeably a little bit. Has there been any discussion about that, especially in the context of the network redesign project, where I think we're anticipating having sort of equivalent service levels, perhaps on that future north-south line, although it technically wouldn't be BRT. Is there any thought that this should perhaps be connected to a certain level of transit service rather than quote unquote BRT to really drive development of based on the transit capacity?
Did you mute yourself? Okay. Go ahead, Philip.
If you're referencing TDM,
No, sorry, I'm referencing the network redesign. So not, I don't think you're involved in that one.
Oh, okay. So if whoever can best answer that question, if you would raise your hand, then I can find you. Tom.
Yeah, I'll just make a brief comment that currently you are investigating the TOD overlay for the east-west line. And as Alder Foster mentioned, the north-south line, although we don't fully know the exact routing of the north-south line, but the north-south line will have comparable frequencies. And that is something that the Planning Commission could adopt, TOD zoning for the north-south line. As I said, though, we're not fully sure of where the north-south line is, but we're fully sure of where the east-west line is. So.
Ben, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, and so I mean, I would also say that would, maybe be the case when the transit network redesign is a little bit further along and there are specific recommendations. I mean, this is a TOD overlay zoning. It's not a BRT overlay zoning. So there certainly could be very high frequency local transit service that comes into play with the transit network redesign, where the commission may want to look at implementing TOD overlay when that is adopted and or implemented. There's nothing that would necessarily prevent that from being considered down the line. Really why we're proceeding with the BRT, kind of following the BRT east-west, is that is and has been locked in for a fair amount of time and is getting certainly very close to being funded and construction starting. So, but yes, could go back and expand TOD use to local bus service as well.
Alder Foster, did you have further questions?
Yeah, I guess just to follow up on that one in particular. I mean, one, I think we should be focused on sort of level of service versus technically BRT versus not. I think that just makes logical sense in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here. It also might help address that question that kind of Tony and was talking about in terms of issues with historic districts. I think the TOD could be BRT agnostic, so that what we're talking about is service levels, not so it wouldn't be a BRT project that would be changing zoning or allowable land use per se. I think also the point about network redesign and timing. I mean, that I think the expectation is that those changes will largely be in place before BRT starts. And I think in every scenario that was shared so far and around that network redesign does show a high frequency, high capacity north-south line. As Tom said, it's there's still some open questions about the exact routing, but I think it would make sense to really think about that as well. I mean, I appreciate all the analysis on the east-west, but in some ways this could also perhaps help inform even that decision around routing for the north-south route, to do some land use analysis and see what that would be. So I guess maybe an ask to have planning staff kind of get the most current thinking around the network redesign work and see how that might expand the TOD based on what's being proposed there.
Thank you, Alder Foster. I think that Heather had some comment too. Heather?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. It's probably something we can look into sooner rather than later. I think, from a big picture standpoint, when we're ready as a city to adopt a different land use framework, we want to make sure that that transit investment is there to stay, right? And so it's, sometimes it's much easier in cities that are investing in light rail, or, it's very fixed. It's almost a forever system. It's a little bit tougher with buses. I think with BRT, what we're seeing is that level of investment that at least ensures that this is a very long-term, if not permanent, transit facility. And I think the same can really probably be extended to some of these other high capacity transit areas that Alder Foster is bringing up this evening. I think one of the things that I did want to mention, one of the reasons we didn't go on the north-south route and do this analysis just yet is because we're not quite sure where that route's going to be. And one of the triggers that we thought made sense was when the council adopted the locally preferred alternative for that east-west route, it seemed fixed enough to kind of move ahead with it. But I think, the analysis is easy enough to do. Not that it's not difficult, but it's easy enough to do to move forward with it more proactively to try to help perhaps guide some decisions.
Thank you, Heather. Ben, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I guess really the other component, this is kind of alluded to and asked about at towards the beginning of the discussion, is the public awareness and engagement portion. And so with transit network redesign not having kind of a final adopted, version of that, it makes it a little more challenging to go out to publicize this TOD effort, TOD overlay effort, and get engagement and feedback from the public when we don't know exactly what might be adopted for the transit network redesign. And, there's certainly some assumptions that can be made based on the work that's been done thus far, but those could also change as it goes through the review, approval, and adoption process. So in some respects, I think from the public engagement and feedback portion, it might be a little challenging to get out too far ahead of that before it's been approved in terms of including those areas as part of the TOD discussion.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Did you have any further questions, Alder Foster?
Yeah, I think just one other one and one comment on that. My understanding is the sort of a proposed route for public feedback in that study is expected to come out in, I think, like mid-January is what we were told at Transportation Policy Board. So I don't know when you're thinking of doing sort of feedback collection for the TOD, but in some ways, I think for the benefit of the public, it would be good for those areas that are on this sort of expected 10-minute service north and south routes. It probably would be best for them to be aware of the potential for interaction with a future TOD. So just something to consider, I guess, there. I think my last question was, in terms of minimums, so it seems like in general, it was the kind of approach was bump everything up one level in terms of maximum units and some height increases. I think the only thing I saw for minimums was maybe on a height minimum and like a 2-story height minimum sort of thing. Are there any other considered minimums, especially in terms of like intensity of use or density of residential use and or commercial, or has that been discussed at all?
Ben. Oh, I thought I unmuted. Okay, there you go.
Sorry, I think I accidentally rapidly remuted myself. I guess a short answer is no. We haven't really delved into like minimum floor area ratios or anything like that. it's really been as far as development form minimums. It's been boosting that height minimum, or in some cases implementing a height minimum. And most of the districts along the BRT corridor, at least, there is no height minimum in place. It's not to say that further minimums couldn't be considered, just that and the things that we've kind of put forth tonight as far as a first draft, that's been really the main minimum that we're showing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe that's something that could be considered a little bit more going forward. And I'm going to have to go to a neighborhood meeting, so I won't be able to participate in the discussion. I wanted to just ask for two possible additional pieces of information in the future. One would be in the presentation, there was a kind of analysis for, I think it was one or two of the zoning districts in terms of sort of how many parcels impacted, area, et cetera. Would it be possible to do that same analysis kind of for all of the impacted districts, to be able to kind of look at those side by side?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And that's not too difficult to map those out. And so, yeah, we can definitely do those in the future. It was just balancing the length of the presentation and allowing time for discussion. But yeah, we can definitely do that.
Great, thank you. And then the last one was, so I think I'll miss the discussion around perhaps confirming this recommendation for the quarter mile zone. I guess, and I missed the last discussion on it. I do think there is value in considering a broader area. I mean, generally up to a half mile, walk distance to a station is for high capacity transit is kind of that the area that's served by. So I don't know. I mean, I saw the previous presentation, but I don't know if it'd be possible to look at that area in between the quarter mile and the half mile and understand sort of what additional parcels would come into that, kind of pros and cons. Perhaps you all will give some clear direction tonight in that regard, but would hate to kind of leave a lot of opportunity on the table in that regard. So I don't know if there's an opportunity to get some more details on that before kind of a final recommendation is given. Thank you.
Sure. And maybe I can just quickly interject or mention that, it doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be quarter mile or half mile. There can be other, considerations to bring into the discussion as well.
Okay, thank you. I do not see any other raised hands. What I'm going to suggest is that we go back and walk through the questions that staff have posed and get some input on those. And to the extent we can reach consensus, great, but at least provide as much input on those questions as possible. So Ben, are you the one who will take us through those questions then? Okay, so the first one is the geography and which zoning districts should be impacted by the TOD overlay. And you see the staff suggestions there. What is the perspective of commissioners' input on those? Commissioner Solheim.
I have some input that I think turned into a question, so sorry because I'm earlier, but I was thinking in general I like the quarter mile. However, I'm sure there are some parcels just outside of that may make sense, and it kind of made me wonder if there's any thought of being able to kind of petition to join the overlay or something, or if that would just fall under a general conditional use to go higher, and we want to keep the overlay as it is.
Heather.
Sure, I think this is a good question, and it came up even when Eric Sundquist was still around in some early discussions that we had with him. I think there is a world where that area between quarter and half could be an opt-in area. You'd have an opportunity as a property owner to decide that you would rather be held to the TOD overlay standards, the carrots and the sticks, rather than the base district standards. And so, I mean, that, I'm trying to channel Matt Tucker and the future zoning administrator who starts next Monday, and I hope they don't, hate that idea. I'd want to talk that over with zoning staff as well, for sure. But I think, if we get that direction this evening, we can certainly move forward with more work in that direction.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I like the idea of that because, again, I'm sure there are some opportunities, but I don't think it makes sense to look at every single parcel at this point. To have some flexibility would be nice. Thank you.
Commissioner Solheim, did you have any comments on the zoning districts then? In addition to
not in particular. I think what has been proposed is appropriate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Cantrell.
Yeah, yes, I'm pretty I'm supportive of the quarter mile for the area of the TOD, but I was wondering, are there going to be some like major stops? I know there's frequent stops along the corridor, but are there some major stops? For example, Easttown, I'm sure, is a major stop. And I can see at that stop, maybe we have a half mile so that it's, there's a lot of commercial out there rather than, restricting it. But so, I can see if there are certain areas along the corridor that make sense to expand the boundary, maybe doing it that way. But I think in general, along this, I don't know how many mile corridor it is, I think a quarter mile is appropriate. And I very much support excluding historic and national registered districts. I think that, again, all the testimony we've had and the reasons I think are quite reasonable why we should. And I think the other zoning districts, I think we're going to see rezonings along the corridor. If there are industrial districts that they want to have TOD, I think we'll see rezoning there, and we'll have reuse of the land. So I think that will take care of itself.
Commissioner, you mentioned local national register districts. What about the area included in the downtown height map?
Oh, I agree with that too.
Okay. Thank you. And did any staff have any comment about Commissioner Cantrell's concept of maybe having bubbles around major stops? I think that gets back to our
but where it makes sense. I mean, Easttown, it makes sense because it's such a big area. But along some of the corridor, it's you get a little bit further out, it's all residential, like staff said. So I guess that's my point. I mean, staff knows this a lot better than I do because they know the city a lot better than I do and all of the other commission members.
Heather, is that something?
Why don't we take a look at that and see if there are some natural candidates for that? I'm thinking back to Commissioner Solheim's question too, and either the opt-in or if we have a defined geography that just has a few larger areas like the mall areas, I suppose that could work. It makes my head explode a little bit, but I don't see a reason why. So let's take a look at it and bring that back also.
Thank you, Commissioner Cantrell, and thank you, Heather, for that response. Alder Heck.
Thank you. I agree with staff suggestions and some of the creative ideas that other commissioners have had. I would like to think about other options too. I don't have answers for how to extend the quarter mile buffer in certain situations, but my thought was to maybe only some aspects of the overlay could extend to a half a mile everywhere, perhaps. I don't know which of those aspects would be appropriate, but to continue to explore some options for extending it, whether it's the ideas that have already been discussed or selective aspects being up to a half mile. But otherwise, I agree with staff suggestions.
Thank you, Alder. I don't see any other raised hands. I agree with staff's suggestions. I do like the quarter mile. And I'm intrigued by Commissioner Cantrell's idea of that staff will be looking at there being potentially some nodes that might make more sense to be larger. And I'm going to ask other commissioners if you are in agreement with what's been said, if you could, nod your head or let me know. Okay, it looks like in general. Okay, good. Then let's move along to question 2. If you could increment, which is number 2 is residential density and intensity increases. The city recently increased densities in most multifamily districts. Staff suggests no further changes at this time. Increased number of units allowed as permitted and conditional uses. Thoughts on that, Commissioner Fernandez?
Thank you. I have to apologize because I think I'm going to have to leave the meeting soon. So I want to just cycle just for a moment back to historic and just say that I am not completely comfortable with excluding National Register districts, but I am not going to certainly stand in the way of a consensus on that. And from a public relations standpoint, I can see where that's much easier. And from an environmental document, I can see where it's simpler. But I personally would rather see the transit-oriented conditions here and the historic preservation handled by a different avenue, rather than have one drive the other. But that said, I just want to kind of register that. And, but it doesn't even have, you're welcome to say consensus because I wouldn't stand in the way. And then the other thing is I would like to see the auto-oriented uses enumerated specifically. I'm concerned with 100 plus non-conforming uses and even the kind of, I don't know, maybe even the legal challenges that come out of that. So I can't add any expertise to that. I like certainly the thrust of prohibiting auto-oriented uses, but I would think that the pencil needs to be sharpened to make sure that that's not creating, non-conforming uses that actually people feel really good about. And with apologies, would I be allowed to leave? Is that right now? I guess I didn't allot that much more time, and so I would appreciate to just be excused, if you may.
We will, of course, miss your input and ideas. But if you have to leave, you have to leave. So.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, so back to the number 2, residential density and intensity increases. Do we have any comments about that? Commissioner Cantrell.
Well, I like how staff explained it, that they're kind of looking at the next tier up for the TOD areas. So I guess if that's what staff is looking for, at least from me as the commission members, I like that concept. So I guess I would agree with that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other Commissioner Solheim.
On the examples, it seemed like a lot of the time it was, what is currently conditional was being moved to permitted, and then there was a new conditional use. And I liked that thought process and think that what staff has proposed makes sense.
Thank you, Commissioner. Are there other comments or input? I would basically agree with the 2 commissioners who have spoken. Other people, I'm seeing some head nods. So it looks like there's agreement there. Okay. If not, raise your hand and let us know. Otherwise, we will move on to number 3, setback adjustments. Multifamily, commercial, mixed use, and employment districts all have fairly minimal setbacks already. No changes recommended. should single-family residential district setbacks be reduced? Commissioner Cantrell.
This is kind of one of my pet peeves in reducing residential setbacks. If along a street the setbacks are established and they're less, I'm supportive of that, moving the building further instead of maybe 20 feet, maybe 15 to the established setback. But if all the buildings on the street are 20 feet and we move the building up to 15, it doesn't look like it should be there. And it's more of an intrusion, especially if you're increasing the density by adding a unit or 3 or 4 units. So I guess I would hope staff would kind of look at that, or at least from my opinion. I think that we want these developments, if they increase density, to at least look like they should be part of the neighborhood rather than something that is an intrusion. So I guess that's my opinion on that one for residential.
Thank you, Commissioner. I see no more raised hands. I totally agree with you on that. And I see other commissioners agreeing with that. If there are any commissioners who disagree, would you please raise your hands and let us know? I don't see any other raised hands. Number 4, uses. And we have had a fair amount of discussion on this. It says prohibit many auto-oriented uses. And I think that I know that we will be getting a list of those, and that there will be more discussion and refinement. Any particular input on that? Commissioner Cantrell.
Yeah, this is one I'm real concerned about, because obviously auto-oriented uses are going to be on high traffic streets. East Washington, perfect example. We have fast food restaurants, gas stations. We're having electric charging stations now that are being constructed. Drive-up windows for banks and Walgreens, and I'm assuming grocery stores will follow because of the convenience. So we have to be very careful on that, because again, I understand that we want to have a very dense corridor, but that corridor provides opportunities for people living in that side of the city. So I think that maybe, and I know this would differ from what staff wants to do, but having like a fast food or a Walgreens having a conditional use for drive-up window. Again, I think that we have to refine that, and we're going to have lots of difficulty with the business community if we say, well, it's all just non-conforming. I mean, that's not going to fly, I don't think. I don't think we can withstand that objection. But so that needs to be further massaged. But I think some uses like car washes, auto repair, auto body shops, those, I think they're more of a not appropriately located next to a dense residential area or apartments. So I think that those could be easily excluded, but I think that the list, we really need to tailor that list down. Thank you.
I think we've got a Alder Heck.
You were muted briefly.
Oh,
so
I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Alder Heck?
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I guess I'm going to dissent a little bit from what Commissioner Cantrell had to say. I think that the idea is to limit auto uses that have impact by virtue of their increased demand on our roads and streets, and that the things like car repair places and things don't really increase the demand so much because they don't really increase traffic. But things like the convenience of drive-through facilities, I think, even coffee shops and Walgreens and all the things we discussed, can have long lines of cars backed up to them, and they really do perpetuate the problems we have with people driving too much. So I think we'll need to think about this. I lean a little bit the other way in that some of those things could, those high demand things could be restricted, but I think we'll have to have some discussion about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Alder Heck. Commissioner Spencer.
Thanks. I just wanted to say I did agree with Commissioner Cantrell on some of the issues with the auto-oriented. I totally understand wanting to, reduce car traffic, especially in high transit areas. And I wasn't thinking so much about fast food places, but I guess they're definitely convenient, but more about banks and pharmacies for people who do have limited mobility but still need to run those errands. And still need to go to the bank, or people who are sick going to the pharmacy just to, reduce that need to actually go inside and expose themselves or expose other people to illness. I mean, we all experienced that during COVID, but it would be nice to extend that even along a heavy transit corridor. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your perspective. This clearly is one that we're going to have to do a lot more thinking about. I think there's pros and cons on both sides. So I think we're going to have to leave this rather up in the air and look forward to getting more thinking from staff on the possibilities there. Then were there other specific uses to prohibit or allow under number 4? Did folks have anything else that they thought should be either prohibited or allowed? Seeing no raised hands, okay, let's go then to number 5, height. Implement 2-story minimum height in most districts. And then second bullet, maximum heights, add 1 additional permitted story to most districts except lower density residential districts. Should some districts like RMX be more aggressive by allowing 2 or 3 additional permitted stories? Thoughts on this, commissioners? Alder Heck.
Thank you. I'm excited about implementing a 2-story minimum in most districts. I think the maximum heights proposed in most districts, adding 1 additional permitted story is a good idea, and agree that lower density residential districts we need to tread carefully. I do appreciate what Alder Foster had to say about building form and making sure we work through that with regards to increasing height. And so that's something I'll be interested in looking at. 2 or 3 more stories in RMX to me seems like a possibility. I'd want to understand how that relates to the adjacent zoning districts again, but I'm not opposed to that. So that some input.
Thank you, Alder. Commissioner Cantrell.
I concur with what Alder Heck said. I agree with his analysis and his comments.
Thank you. Other input from commissioners? Okay, then I'm going to ask commissioners to give some indication whether you agree with the comments that have been made, Okay, great, thank you. Then we will move on to parking. Remove all minimum parking exceptions. Do not permit parking in excess of maximum, and then should maximum parking be reduced. And easier, more expansive parking reduction process. Thoughts about this? Commissioner Solheim.
I definitely support removing the minimum parking exceptions. I feel like I don't know enough about maximum parking to make a judgment on reducing that. And I think in terms of the parking reduction process, if I remember correctly, we have a certain like amount or percentage that you can just apply to the zoning department to get that. And maybe we have like a higher percentage or something like that in this area. But in general, I am supportive of these items.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Cantrell.
I'm supportive of removal of all minimum parking exceptions and the maximums too. I think that we shouldn't permit parking in exceeding the maximums. I think some uses want to provide additional parking because that's what their national policy says, and I think that we shouldn't allow that to happen here. And easier, more expansive parking reduction process. Whatever staff believes in that case, I think is appropriate. I guess I'd like to know a little bit more about that, but I don't necessarily disagree with it.
Any other commissioners' input? I agree with what has been said. The only concern that I might have on the parking is I think we need to be careful and then think about the possibility of the city being pushed to provide public parking. I've got some concerns about private developments kind of putting off their expenses in terms of parking onto the city. So I think we need to really be careful about that and be aware that this is something that may happen and think long and hard about that.
Good point.
Anything else? Do people in general agree with the comment so far? I'm seeing yes. Okay, thank you. Then the final question is single-family districts. How should TOD overlay impact these districts? And then we have 4 options here. What are commissioners' thoughts about these? Commissioner Cantrell.
Well, I guess I would be more supportive of option 2, allow an extra unit on lots meeting existing lot area requirements. I think that makes a lot of sense in my opinion. And in some of these areas we have low enough lot requirements that you could get additional units or more. So that would be my suggestion. I guess I'd like other commission members to weigh in on this one though.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Alder Heck. For some reason, when I hit unmute, it's not unmuted.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Now I'm unmuted.
Yes, you are.
I'm also going to turn my camera off. I agree with Commissioner Cantrell and lean towards extra unit on lots meeting existing lot area requirements, although I may be open to an extension of that to less lot area, but I'd need to see a lot more information, I think, to evaluate that appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other input? Commissioner Solheim.
I agree. I think that ties into kind of what we talked about with setbacks earlier in terms of, kind of preserving the character and what that single family area is currently, and making sure that if an additional unit is allowed, I think that's great. It should just, not, I guess, make a noticeable impact, or, like we talked about, like a unit suddenly being in front of the single family home or something like that. So I think that second bullet point is appropriate.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other comments, input? Heather.
I am not a commissioner, but I wanted to share that the accessory dwelling units did pass at the council earlier this week. And so citywide, for any single family home, there is the ability as a permitted use to add either an internal or a detached accessory dwelling unit. And I think that staff hasn't had time to really think about that in light of this. And we want to make sure that we're providing enough of a boost within the single family areas. One idea that literally just is coming to mind is, perhaps this would be a case where a property owner could create a 2-unit home and have a detached ADU. And it would be the only such case in the city. Again, I'm thinking out loud here, but I do want a little bit of space for the staff team, if the Plan Commission agrees, to think about differentiation of these areas beyond the fact that now every single family home can have an ADU.
Thank you for raising that, Heather. And in general, I agree with the second bullet, but I will look forward to hearing what staff think about in terms of the change to the ADU also. Other commissioners, could you indicate in some way that you're on board? Okay, good. And if any are not, if you could raise your hand and contribute. Okay. Okay, then I'm going to ask staff, have you gotten sufficient input to go ahead and move forward, or do you have any other questions or comments to the commissioners? Okay, I don't see any raised staff hand ups. Heather, go ahead.
Sorry, I wanted to give opportunities to Ben and Colin first. I feel like we've had a really great amount of input from the commission. Really appreciate you digging into this. We have a lot of work to do, but that's what we wanted coming out of this is, what more information do you need as we try to march forward in the next several months? I think that I'll work with Chair Zellers in the coming month or so to kind of schedule our next meeting and think about the main highlights of that and what we can get back before you for next time. But thank you so much. And Ben, Colin, I really want to thank both of them for all the work put into preparation for this discussion.
Thank you. And I second that appreciation. And also to Tom Lynch and Phil Gritzmacher for being here to help answer some of the questions that we had. So thank you, staff, very much for making this a productive work session. With that, I will move on to the next item on the agenda, business by members or announcements. Are there any business items by members or announcements? Seeing no raised hands, I think the next item will be adjournment. A motion to adjourn by Commissioner Cantrell. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Solheim, and I will assume unanimous consent unless I see a raised hand to object. Seeing no raised hands to object, we are adjourned. And I will see you all on Monday. Thank you.